We have to move. Now.
I'm pushing, just go.
This way, hurry!
It hurts. Hang on, sweetie.
Almost there, keep moving!
The day began with the kind of quiet normalcy that tricks you into believing nothing could possibly go wrong. The sky was pale with early morning light. The roads were still thin with traffic as I helped my daughter settle into the back seat. Carefully securing her wheelchair and checking every strap twice out of habit. Because routine was how we managed everything in our lives, routine kept. Or calm routine kept me in control, and most importantly, routine kept the unpredictable at a safe distance, or at least that is what I had always believed until that morning when something subtle and almost invisible began to shift. Beneath the surface of what should have been just another ordinary drive, she sat quietly as we pulled away. From the house, her fingers moving gently in the air, tracing patterns only she could see her lips. Humming a soft, repetitive melody that she used to anchor herself against anxiety, and I glanced at her. Through the rearview mirror, offering a small, reassuring smile which she returned faintly, her eyes already carrying that distant, cautious awareness she always had when we left familiar spaces because the world outside, our home, was never entirely safe for her, not in the way it was for others. And I knew that better than anyone, which is why I chose routes, carefully avoided crowded places, avoided anything that might trigger her fear, especially darkness, because darkness was never just darkness to her. It was suffocating. It was disorienting. It was a trap that stole her sense of control and replaced it with overwhelming panic, and yet, despite knowing all of that, I made the decision to take the tunnel that day, the same tunnel I had used countless times before, because it was faster. Because it was predictable, because it had never given me a reason to doubt it until now, and as we approached the entrance, I felt something I could not immediately explain, a subtle tension in my chest, a hesitation that lingered just long enough to make me slow down slightly as my eyes scanned the area ahead, and that was when I saw her standing near the maintenance control panel, positioned just off to the side of the tunnel entrance, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed directly on our car, in a way that felt intentional rather than coincidental, and even before my mind fully processed it, I recognized her, the same woman from our HOA, the one who had turned our lives into a series of constant complaints and accusations, the one who seemed to find fault in everything we did, no matter how small or insignificant, as if our existence itself offended her sense of order. She had reported us for parking violations that did not exist, for noise complaints on days we had barely made, a sound for property issues that were entirely fabricated, and every interaction with her had carried the same underlying message that we did not belong there, that she wanted us gone. And seeing her there at that moment, standing beside equipment she had no reason to be near, sent a ripple of unease through me that I could not ignore, and as we drove closer, her expression shifted. Just slightly, the corners of her mouth lifting into something that almost resembled a smile, but there was no warmth in it, no friendliness, only a cold, deliberate awareness that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel as I considered for a brief second whether I should turn around, whether I should choose another route, whether I should listen to the instinct telling me something was not right. But the moment passed too quickly, the car already crossing the threshold into the tunnel, the outside light fading behind us as the interior swallowed us in its dim, artificial glow, and I exhaled slowly, trying to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, as overthinking, as something born from weeks of tension with her rather than an actual threat. And I reassured myself that this was still just a tunnel, just a road, just a few minutes before we would be back in open daylight, and everything would be fine. But my daughter's humming grew slightly louder, a subtle sign that she was becoming uneasy, and I spoke to her gently, keeping my voice calm and steady, telling her we would be out soon, that it was just the usual route, that nothing had changed. And she nodded faintly, though her fingers continued moving faster now, her body responding to something she could not fully articulate, and we moved deeper into the tunnel, the overhead lights passing in a steady rhythm, casting brief shadows that flickered across the windshield, and the walls on either side seemed closer than I remembered, the space narrower, the air heavier, and I found myself glancing at the rear view mirror again, half expecting to see something behind us, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch we had already traveled and the faint echo of our own movement filling the confined space. And then it happened without warning, without flicker, without any gradual transition. The lights went out completely, not dimmed, not failed in sections, but vanished entirely, as if someone had flipped a switch and erased the world around us in a single instant, plunging us into a darkness so absolute it felt unreal, like something physical pressing in from all sides, and for a fraction of a second there was silence, the kind of silence that exists between realization and reaction, and then my daughter screamed a sharp, piercing sound filled with pure, unfiltered terror that tore through the confined space and echoed back at us, magnified and distorted in my heart. Slammed violently against my ribs as adrenaline surged through me, my hands tightening instinctively on the wheel as I tried to maintain control of the car, even as my vision struggled to adjust to the sudden absence of light, and I spoke her name immediately, my voice louder, now urgent but controlled, because I knew I could not let panic take over. Not for her, not now. And I told her I was there, that she was not alone, that everything was okay, even though in that moment I knew it was not okay at all, because this was not a random outage, not a simple malfunction. The precision of it, the timing, the memory of that woman standing by the control panel just seconds before we entered, all of it aligned too perfectly to ignore, and a cold realization settled into my chest that this had been intentional, that someone had chosen this exact moment, this exact place, knowing we would be inside, knowing what it would do to her. And as her screams broke into desperate, gasping sobs, I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking. It's just enough to make it difficult to unlock, but I managed to activate the flashlight, the small beam cutting weakly through the darkness, revealing only fragments of our surroundings, the dashboard, the immediate stretch of road ahead, the edges of the concrete walls, but beyond that, nothing, only an endless void that swallowed the light before it could reach anything meaningful. And I glanced in the mirror, seeing her face illuminated in harsh shadows, her eyes wide, unfocused, her breathing already becoming erratic, her body reacting exactly as I had feared it would. And I reached back with one hand, keeping the other on the wheel, touching her arm, grounding her as best as I could, telling her to listen to me, to focus on my voice, to breathe slowly with me, even as I could feel the situation spiraling beyond anything I could easily control. And the realization hit me fully then. We were trapped in a sealed tunnel, cut off from light, cut off from help, cut off from the outside world, and somewhere beyond those walls, the person responsible was still there, knowing exactly what they had done, and for the first time. That morning, the unease I had felt at the entrance transformed into something far more concrete, far more dangerous, because this was no longer just tension or conflict or harassment. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, something calculated. And as I sat there in the suffocating darkness with my daughter's terrified cries filling the space around us, I understood that this moment was not an accident. It was the result of a choice. And now we were the ones forced to survive. The darkness did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as if it had weight pressing in from every direction, swallowing sound, distorting space, turning something as familiar as a road into an unknown void. And in the middle of it, my daughter's panic escalated. Rapidly, her breathing breaking into sharp, uneven gasps that echoed too loudly in the confined space, her hands clawing blindly at the air before gripping the edges of her seat as if she were trying to hold herself together. And I forced myself to stay focused, pushing down the surge of fear rising in my chest, because if I lost control even for a moment, she would feel it. And that would only make everything worse. So I spoke to her continuously, my voice steady, deliberate, repeating her name, guiding her to listen to me, to match my breathing, even as my own lungs felt tight and uncooperative. And I reached back again, brushing my hand against her arm, grounding her in something real, something physical, reminding her she was not alone, even though the darkness made it feel otherwise. And with my other hand, I adjusted the phone light, angling it toward her face just enough so she could see something, anything, because complete darkness was the trigger, the thing that sent her mind spiraling into chaos. And the faint glow seemed to help for a brief second, her breathing slowing just slightly before another wave of panic hit harder than the last. Her body shaking violently now, her voice breaking into fragmented pleas that cut through me with a sharpness I could not ignore. and I knew then we could not stay still. Waiting was not an option, not when every second in this environment pushed her closer to a state I might not be able to pull her back from, and I looked ahead. Again, the narrow beam of light revealing nothing but an endless stretch of tunnel with no visible exit, no emergency doors. No signs, no markings, just blank concrete that felt indifferent to our presence, and I shifted the car into gear, inching forward. Slowly, the tires rolling over the unseen road beneath us, the sound amplified unnaturally in the enclosed space, and for a moment, I considered turning back, but the memory of the entrance, the image of that woman standing there, stopped me cold, because if this was intentional, then going back might mean going straight toward whatever control she still had, and that thought alone was enough to push me forward instead. Choosing the unknown ahead over the known threat behind, and as we moved, the light from my phone flickered slightly, not enough to go out, but enough to send a spike of fear through me, because it reminded me how fragile our situation was, how dependent we were on something so small, so unreliable, and I tightened my grip on it, adjusting my hold so it would not slip again like it had earlier, and I spoke to her again louder, now more insistent, guiding her through each breath, counting slowly, 1, 2, 3, inhale, 1, 2, 3, exhale, trying to create rhythm, trying to give her something to latch onto, while everything else around us offered nothing but emptiness, and she tried. I could see it in the way her chest moved unevenly, in the way her fingers curled into the fabric of her seat, focusing on sensation instead of absence, but the panic was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, threatening to surge again at any moment, and I knew time was working against us because her condition was not just emotional, it was physical, her body reacting in ways that could become dangerous if the stress continued unchecked, and I glanced at my phone again, checking for signal, even though I already knew what I would see, and sure enough, there was nothing, no bars, no connection, no way to call for help, no way to reach anyone. Outside this sealed space, and that realization settled heavily in my mind, reinforcing the isolation, making it clear that whatever happened next would depend entirely on what I could do in this moment with no external support, and I swallowed hard, pushing that thought aside because it did not help to dwell on what I did not have. I needed to focus on what I did have, which was her, which was the car, which was the faint light in my hand, and whatever options I could find within the confines of this tunnel. And as we moved further, the air seemed to change, subtly becoming cooler, heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent that I had never noticed before, and it made the environment feel even more hostile, even more unnatural, as if the tunnel itself had shifted from a simple passageway into something oppressive. Something designed to contain rather than allow escape, and my mind kept returning to her, the woman at the entrance. The way she had looked at us, the timing of the blackout, the precision of it, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this had not been random, that it had been planned, that she had known we would take this route, known we would enter at that exact moment, and that thought ignited something sharp inside me, cutting through the fear with a growing sense of anger, because this was not just inconvenience. This was not just harassment. This was endangerment. This was a deliberate act that had put my daughter in a situation she was uniquely vulnerable to, and as that realization solidified, it gave me something else to hold on to, something stronger than fear alone, a determination that we were not going to stay trapped here, that I was not going to let her actions define how this ended. And I pressed forward, slowly scanning the walls more carefully now, looking for anything out of place. Any sign of an emergency system, any indication that this tunnel had been designed with contingencies? Because it had to be there, had to be something hidden somewhere that could restore power or open a way out, and my eyes strained against the limited light, catching small details I would have ignored before, faint seams in the concrete, slight variations in texture markings that suggested panels or access points, but nothing immediately obvious, nothing clearly labeled, nothing easy, and my daughter's breathing hit. Another peak, her body tensing again as a fresh wave of panic surged through her, stronger than before, and I stopped the car, immediately turning fully toward her, her reaching back with both hands, now abandoning the wheel for the moment because she needed me more than the car did, and I held her arms firmly, not restraining but grounding, speaking her name again and again, anchoring her in the sound of my voice, reminding her where she was, who she was with, telling her to stay, with me to focus only on me and nothing else, and for a moment it worked her breathing, catching, slowing slightly, her attention shifting just enough to break the spiral, but I could feel how fragile that control was, how easily it could shatter again. If the environment did not change and that urgency pushed me to act faster, to think more aggressively about how to get us out, because staying here was not sustainable, not for her, not for either of us. And I took a deep breath, steadying myself, forcing clarity over panic, and I made a decision that felt risky, but necessary. I was going to get out of the car and search the tunnel on foot, because sitting here waiting for something to change was no longer an option. And as I reached for the door handle, I glanced at her one more time, offering what reassurance I could, even as I prepared to step into the unknown darkness beyond knowing that whatever I found or did not find in the next few moments could determine everything that came after. The moment I stepped out of the car, the atmosphere shifted in a way that felt immediate and deeply unsettling, as if the thin barrier that had separated us from the tunnel itself had vanished, and now I was fully exposed to it, the cold air wrapping around me, carrying a damp, metallic scent that seemed stronger outside than it had inside the vehicle, and the faint echo of my own movement stretched unnaturally in every direction, each step reverberating off the concrete walls and returning just a fraction too late, creating the illusion that something else was moving nearby, something just out of sync with me, and I forced myself to ignore that sensation, focusing instead on the narrow beam of my phone light as I turned back briefly to check on my daughter, still seated in the car, her face barely visible in the dim glow, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of fear and desperate trust that hit me harder than anything else in that moment. And I spoke to her again, keeping my voice steady, telling her I was right there, that I was not going far, that she needed to keep listening to me, keep breathing with me just like before, and she nodded weakly, her hands gripping the sides of her seat as if anchoring herself to the only stable point she had left, and that image stayed with me as I turned away, moving along the side of the tunnel, my eyes scanning every inch of the wall for anything that might indicate an access point, a control panel, an emergency exit, anything that suggested this place had been designed with safety in mind, because right now it felt like the opposite. It felt like a sealed corridor with no intention of letting anything out once it was inside, and my footsteps echoed again, louder now, in the absence of the car's presence behind me, and I realized just how isolated we truly were. No distant sounds of traffic, no vibrations from above, nothing to suggest there was a world beyond these walls, and that realization pressed down on me heavily. But I pushed forward anyway, because stopping was not an option, not when every second mattered, not when I could still hear her breathing unevenly behind me, each fragile inhale a reminder of why I was doing this, and moved slowly, deliberately, keeping the light steady, tracing the seams in the concrete, noticing how some sections looked slightly different from others. Small inconsistencies that might have gone unnoticed under normal lighting, but now stood out just enough to draw attention, and I reached out, running my free hand along the surface, feeling for edges, for gaps, for anything that might give under pressure. But most of it was solid, unyielding, cold to the touch, offering nothing in return, and frustration began to creep in sharp and persistent, because time was slipping away faster than I could search, and I had no guarantee that what I was looking for even existed, and yet kept going, driven by the simple fact that doing nothing would guarantee failure. And as I moved further from the car, the darkness behind me seemed to thicken, swallowing the faint outline of the vehicle until it was little more than a shadow at the edge of my vision, and I felt a brief surge of hesitation, a pull to go back, to stay close to her, to not risk the distance growing between us. But I forced myself to continue, because I knew I needed to find something that could change the situation, something that could bring light back into this place and break over her. And then I heard it, a faint sound, at first so subtle I almost dismissed it as an echo of my own movement, but it came again, sharper. This time a metallic click, followed by a low hum that seemed to travel through the walls themselves, and I froze instantly, my body tensing as I tried to pinpoint the direction of the noise, my light shifting slightly as I turned, scanning the tunnel ahead and behind, but there was nothing visible, no movement, no source, no indication of where it had come from, and yet the sound lingered, vibrating faintly in the air before fading into silence again and in. That moment a realization settled over me that whatever system had been used to shut down the lights was not entirely inactive, that something was still connected, still responsive, possibly even being controlled remotely. And the thought sent a chill through me, because it meant this situation was not just static. It was being maintained, and that implied intention, ongoing deliberate intention. And my mind immediately went back to her, the woman at the entrance. The way she had watched us, the certainty in her expression, and now the idea that she might still be nearby, still interacting with whatever system controlled this tunnel, made the situation feel even more dangerous, even more unpredictable. And I clenched my jaw, pushing that thought aside because fear of her actions would not help me find a solution, and I needed to stay focused on what I could control, which was this search. This moment, this narrow window of opportunity to find something, anything, that could restore power or open a path out, and I moved again, faster now, my steps more urgent, my light sweeping across the walls with greater intensity. And that was when I saw a small irregularity in the surface just ahead, a section of the wall where the concrete looked slightly recessed. Not by much, just enough to break the uniformity. And I approached it quickly, my heart picking up pace as hope sparked cautiously in my chest, and I ran my hand over it, feeling along the edges until my fingers caught on a thin seam outlining what appeared to be a panel partially concealed by grime and wear, and without hesitation I pressed against it. At first nothing happened, the surface resisting my effort, but I adjusted my grip, applying more force, pushing harder, till suddenly it shifted with a dull, grinding sound, the panel giving way just enough to reveal a narrow gap, and I pulled it open, fully exposing a small compartment inside, and for a brief second, I simply stared at it, my mind processing what I was seeing. A set of mechanical components, a lever positioned vertically alongside a series of labeled switches. Though most of the text was faded and difficult to read in the low light, and I felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly overwhelmed me, because this was something tangible, something designed for situations exactly like this, even if it had not been meant for someone like me, too. Yus and I reached inside, immediately my hand closing around the lever, feeling its cold, solid weight, and for a moment I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of awareness that whatever this did would have consequences that I did not fully understand. But that hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, because behind me in the distance, I could still hear my daughter, her breathing fragile, uneven, a constant reminder that inaction was not an option, and so I pulled the lever with all the strength. I had the mechanism resisting at first, before suddenly releasing with a loud clunk that echoed violently through the tunnel, and for a moment, nothing changed. The darkness remained, the air still heavy, the silence intact, and my heart dropped sharply. A wave of fear crashing in as I wondered if it had failed, if I had misunderstood, if this had been nothing more than a dead system abandoned and useless. But then faintly, almost imperceptibly, at first a single light flickered somewhere down the tunnel, a weak, unstable glow that struggled to hold before stabilizing. It's just enough to remain, and then another followed, and another, each one coming to life in a staggered sequence, stretching outward, like a chain reaction, pushing back against the darkness inch by inch, and I exhaled sharply, the tension in my chest releasing. Just enough to allow relief to break through, and I turned immediately, looking back toward the car, the faint illumination now revealing its outline more clearly, and I could see her inside, her face still tense, but no longer completely swallowed by shadow, and I did not waste another second. I closed the panel quickly, leaving it open just enough in case I needed it again, and I ran back toward her, my footsteps echoing louder now, but no longer as oppressive, because the presence of light, however weak, had changed the space, had broken the illusion of total isolation. And as I reached the car, I opened the door, immediately leaning in toward her, speaking her name again, my voice softer now, but still urgent, still focused, and I could see the difference already, her breathing still uneven, but slowing, her eyes able to focus again. Now that there was something to see, something to ground her, and I placed my hand over hers, steady, reassuring, reminding her that we were getting out, that this was working, that she needed to stay with me just a little longer, and as she nodded faintly, I felt a renewed determination settle in, stronger than before because now we had a chance. Now the tunnel was no longer completely against us, and whatever had been done to trap us here was no longer absolute, and that meant we could fight it. We could move forward, we could get out, and I closed the door, carefully moving. Back to the driver's seat, my mind already shifting to the next step, the next decision. The next movement that would carry us closer to the exit and further away from the darkness that had nearly taken everything from us. The moment the faint chain of lights flickered back to life, it felt less like a full victory and more like a fragile lifeline. Something temporary, something that could vanish again at any second, and I knew we could not afford to waste even a moment. As I hurried back into the driver's seat, my hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline while my daughter's breathing steadied, just enough for her to focus on the dim light around us, her eyes locked onto it as if it were the only thing, keeping her anchored to reality, and I spoke softly but firmly, telling her we were leaving now, that we were getting out of the tunnel, and she needed to stay with me just a little longer, and she nodded weakly, her grip still tight, but no longer frantic, and that small change gave me the push I needed to move forward as I shifted the car into gear and began driving slowly, following the scattered overhead lights that stretched ahead in uneven intervals, each one casting pale pools of illumination, separated by shadows that still felt too deep, too uncertain, and every time we passed beneath one, I could feel the tension in my chest ease slightly, only for it to return again in the darker gaps between them, and I kept my speed controlled, careful not to rush, because the last thing we needed was another problem, another mistake in a situation already hanging by a thread, and the tunnel seemed longer now than it ever had before, each meter dragging out as if the space itself was resisting. Our escape and I kept glancing between the road and my daughter, watching her closely, listening to every breath, ready to respond if her panic surged again, but she held on, her focus locked on the rhythm of light and shadow as if she were counting them, using them to stay grounded, and I continued speaking to her, quietly guiding her through it, reminding her she was doing well, that we were almost there, even though I could not yet see the exit. And then in the distance, I noticed something different. A faint glow that did not flicker like the others, a steady light brighter than the rest, and my heart lifted, instantly recognizing it as the tunnel exit, and I pressed forward a little more, urgency slipping into my movement as the car rolled toward it, the dim overhead lights becoming more frequent now, as if the system was stabilizing or perhaps losing control entirely, and as we got closer, the outside world began to take shape. Beyond the tunnel, opening, the pale daylight spilling in like a promise, like a release from everything we had just endured, and I felt a surge of relief so strong it almost overwhelmed me, but I stayed focused, guiding the car straight toward it until finally we crossed the threshold and emerged into open air, the brightness flooding the interior of the car, instantly washing away the oppressive darkness that had surrounded us. And my daughter reacted immediately, her body relaxing in a way that told me she was coming back fully, her breathing deepening, her grip loosening as the worst of the fear released its hold on her, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. My hands still tight on the wheel as I continued driving forward, putting as much distance between us and the tunnel as possible, and then as I glanced to the side near the entrance, I saw her again, the same woman standing exactly where she had been before. But now her expression was completely different, the confidence gone, replaced by something closer to shock. As she watched us emerge alive, and in that moment everything became clear, not just what she had done, but how certain she had been that it would end differently. And I did not stop. I did not slow down. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply drove past her, my focus entirely on getting my daughter somewhere safe, somewhere stable, somewhere far away from the darkness she had been forced into. And as the tunnel disappeared behind us, I knew this was not over, not by a long shot. Because what had happened inside was not just an accident or a mistake, it was something deliberate, something dangerous, and the moment we were safe, I would make sure it was answered for, but for now, all that mattered was that we had made it out, that the light had returned, and that she was still here with me, holding on to the world that someone else had tried to take away from her. And that was enough to keep me moving forward without looking back, even once. The moment we put distance between ourselves and the tunnel, the reality of what had just happened began to settle. And not all at once, but in waves, each one heavier than the last, as the adrenaline that had kept me moving started to fade, leaving behind a sharp clarity that made every detail stand out with painful precision, and I kept driving longer than necessary, not because I did not know where to go, but because I needed to be absolutely sure we were far enough away from that place, from her, from whatever control she thought she had over our lives. And only when my daughter's breathing had fully stabilized and her body had relaxed back into the seat did I finally slowed down, pulling into a safe open area where the sunlight was strong and constant, where there were people in the distance, where the world felt real again. And I turned to look at her properly for the first time since we escaped seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the lingering fear that had not completely faded, but also the strength that had taken for her to hold on through something that should never have happened. And I reached back, taking her hand gently, reassuring her that it was over, that she was safe, that the darkness was gone and would not touch her again. And though she did not say much, her grip tightened around mine in a quiet response that said more than words ever could. And after a few moments, I stepped out of the car, pulling my phone back up, checking the signal, and watching as the bar slowly returned, reconnecting me to the outside world that had felt impossibly far away just minutes ago. And that was when the shift happened inside me. The fear that had dominated everything began to transform into something colder, more focused, more deliberate, because now there was no confusion left, no uncertainty about what had taken place. This had been intentional, planned, timed, executed, with the belief that we would not be able to fight it, that we would break under it. And that realization carried a weight that could not be ignored. And I immediately began documenting everything: the time, the location, the sequence of events, every detail I could recall while it was still fresh, because I knew this was not something that could be left unchallenged, not something that could be brushed aside as an accident or dismissed as a coincidence. And once I was certain my daughter was stable, I made the call, explaining the situation clearly, firmly refusing to let emotion distort the facts, because the truth alone was enough. The unauthorized access to the tunnel system, the targeted timing, the endangerment of a vulnerable person. And as the process began, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, not relief exactly, but certainty, the kind that comes when a line has been crossed so clearly that there is no longer any doubt about what needs to happen next. And later, when everything moved forward, when the evidence was reviewed, when her actions were traced back and confirmed, I saw her again, not in the neighborhood, not standing confidently behind complaints and false authority, but in a place where those things meant nothing, where the weight of what she had done stood on its own, undeniable. And I watched as she avoided my gaze, no longer in control, no longer certain. And I realized then that what she had tried to create in that tunnel had followed her out into the light, not the darkness she intended for us, but the consequences she had never prepared for. And in that moment, I felt no need for anger, no need for confrontation, because the outcome spoke for itself. And as I turned away, returning to my daughter, who was waiting safely where she belonged, I understood something with absolute clarity: that the darkness we had been trapped in had not been the end of our story. It had been the beginning of hers unraveling in a way she could not stop and would not escape. And for me, that was enough to finally leave it behind and move forward without carrying its shadow any further.